Greetings, everybody. So glad y'all could join me again today. Today, I am actually going to dive into some of the internal workings of the libertarian movement and some of the challenges that it faces at present within its own ranks. And here to discuss that issue with me today, based on his own personal experience, is my friend Jake Bobe. Jake?
Hey, good to be with you, Akil.
My pleasure. So, Jake, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, your schooling, and what you do currently?
Well, I try to do what I can when I can to advance the liberty message that you and me have worked with before in the past, Akil. As you recall, we were both in Students for Liberty activism together in 2013 and sometime around that time. And it seemed like we were really onto something in 2013. Low taxes, social liberties, civil liberties, and peace and prosperity. And what happened? I don't remember the liberty movement being about a bunch of, quite frankly, racist cranks sometimes, That wasn't the liberty movement I've ever been about. And I'm sure it's not what you've ever involved yourself into either as well. How did we get to this point? How do we reach this point where a lot of people seem to think that libertarianism is code for alt-right? I don't find this concept of Berlin-style border walls to be very libertarian. That's not what this movement's about. I think the real big divide right now inside those liberty circles, Akil, is this whole question over where rights come from. Are they derived from the government? Is the president going to grant us rights? Or are we going to determine that these rights are inalienable? I've been really frustrated with this strain of far-right collectivism.
That's definitely true that statism definitely comes in different flavors, right-wing as well as left-wing.
Yes, exactly.
It's lost on a lot of people. Like you just said, the question is definitely how did so many, like you said, racist cranks and otherwise bigoted cranks start rearing their ugly heads within the ranks of the liberty movement? I think it's probably been the case for a long time that some of them have been there, but they've been crawling out of the woodwork, especially in the past couple of years. And it seems to have a lot to do with the whole Trump phenomenon. So what has been your specific participation in the movement? And give us some examples of some of these cranks that you've seen and how you've encountered them and had to deal with them in your own personal work.
Just a little bit about me personally and my background with this whole thing. I wasn't always liberty movement, Akil. I was one of those who back in 2008, I was really involved in Youth for McCain-Palin stuff. The recession hit, the wars started getting worse, and Ron Paul's arguments about fiscal responsibility at home and abroad actually made sense. Like, that liberty movement was what I was involved with. I got really involved in 2012. I've worked on campaigns before, some liberties, some not. I try to work for the liberty ones. I was in Iowa for Rand Paul. I was in Des Moines. We might feel like we're the only ones sometimes who feel this way about this, but a lot of the people I was with for Rand Paul in Iowa, in the caucuses just last year, like we weren't about Trump, we just didn't like this whole right-wing authoritarianism any more than we cared Barack Obama.
Right, exactly. That's always been part of the appeal of libertarianism for me. I mean, when I was in college and sort of gravitating in that direction, what really appealed to me about it, and this was largely thanks to sources of libertarian opinion and analysis such as Reason Magazine and the Cato Institute.
Yes.
What really appealed to me about it was they didn't have or seem to have a lot of the cultural baggage that comes with a lot of modern conservatism, coming from backgrounds where they're often hostile to racial minority groups or sexual minorities or certain religious minorities like the Muslim community, et cetera, et cetera. I always really enjoyed the libertarian movement just because this is an area where I can feel comfortable. I no longer identify with the left, but at the same time, I'm not really on the same page with conservatives or the Republican Party in too many different areas. And so libertarianism appealed to me. And then when I started getting involved in the actual movement when I was in law school, all the libertarians I met were some of the most open-minded, tolerant, pluralistic-minded people I had met. I met a lot of young people. I met a lot of women. I met a lot of libertarian feminists and so on. I met a lot of libertarians who are members of the criminal justice reform movement, the drug policy reform movement, opposed to foolish foreign wars and things of that nature. People like you and me, right? The problem is in the past couple of years, I've noticed two phenomena. On the one hand, the emergence of a lot of these, like you put them, right-wing cranks who keep infiltrating the movement, joining organizations like YAL, Young Americans for Liberty, or even SFL from what I've heard. And on the other hand, I've noticed a lot of friends of mine from the movement who've been leaving the movement partly because of that phenomenon. And some of them seem to have gone all the way over to the left, full SJW. This all coincided with the time when I had to see in early 2015 and come back here to Canada. And ever since then, I've been looking on with growing frustration at the developments that I see behind the scenes in the movement south of the border, particularly among young libertarians. I found that a really dismaying development because it makes me concerned about the kind of image that we're projecting. Just in the 2016 election, when we had an unprecedented opportunity to put our names and our movement on the map for most of the American public who haven't heard of us yet, through the Gary Johnson campaign and so on, a lot of folks seem determined to screw it up by giving us a bad name on both left and right. I mean, I've seen you confront some of these same cranks online. So what are some specific examples of the emergence of these alt-right leaning types in the liberty movements that you've noticed?
Well, I think Trump played a big part of it, but especially in hindsight, like the signs were there before. There were certain elements of conservatism that I think were always more authoritarian minded than what we libertarians, or at least you and me trying to be consistent libertarians in principle, notice on the right. I was foreign policy contributor for the Liberty Conservative. Rocco Lucente first invited me into his organization of sorts in February 2015. We were at CPAC for Rand Paul together, and he liked my article that I wrote about the drone strikes in Yemen for a group called Punk Rock Libertarians. We all seemed to get along just fine until the Donald Trump phenomenon completely took things in a ridiculous direction. I was one of those who happens to believe in a lot of what we were fighting for in Iowa for the likes of Rand Paul and Ron Paul before that. We wanted liberty in our lifetimes, and we didn't want to have to resort to this kind of racial ridiculousness in reaction to the craziness that we sometimes see from the SJWs on the radical left. So I was made victim of a pretty remarkably complex disinformation campaign by a lot of these people at the Liberty Conservative. They make up all these things that don't even make sense sometimes. How I was supposedly fired for them when I never even worked for them. How the quality of my writing mostly centered around foreign policy updates in the Middle East and Yemen, all over the world. And I covered some parts of Rand Paul's campaign in Iowa. I had a lot of contacts with a lot of people back then. I was interviewing an African American advocacy group that was libertarian at the time, and they were all for Rand Paul in 2015. Like, that's the kind of content that I was seeking to make Liberty Conservative about. It has since then strayed from any sense of that vision that I used to truly believe in. And I wish that the people that are probably going to watch this and make shit up about it, I don't know what to say to them. They used to be like-minded, just like you and me were, Akil. And they have since strayed in another direction that really isn't very pro-liberty most of the time. I wish that they would reflect on their behavior since then and come to the conclusion that they fucked up. They had a great thing going, and they turned it all to shit, I think. You know, it just isn't conservative, and it isn't pro-liberty by any stretch to be for the likes of Richard Spencer and white nationalism and such.
I agree completely. And that's one thing I've been saying about the Trump phenomenon. He's taken people who formerly seemed to have a grain of sense in their heads and made them take leave of their senses. He's just brought out the worst in so many people across the whole political spectrum. People on the right who have just sold out their principles in order to have a shot at power, and people on the left in sometimes making them react with such rage that a lot of them are embracing tactics that really are self-defeating, counterproductive, shoot themselves in the foot, give themselves a bad name, et cetera, et cetera. That definitely rings true in light of everything I've seen going on since the election.
I think part of the Trump phenomenon and the phenomenon of liberty types that we know get caught up in alt-rightism or in other extremist ideologies out there is this failure on the part of the early Tea Party movement to stay consistently fiscal. Speaking as someone who was in the early Tea Party movement, like 2009, the Great Recession was happening. The movement in the beginning was as definitively anti-Bush as it was also anti-Obama. It should have stayed that way. When in 2010, you might recall that we had the crisis over SB 1070 in Arizona. And these Tea Party movement types who were often preaching, they were talking a great talk when it came to like, yeah, we need lower taxes. We need a smaller government. And that should have been the fundamental message from the beginning. It shouldn't have been this whole idea that the immigrants were the problem and they started scapegoating Muslims and people like that, before we saw this rise in 14 and 15 of police shootings. People got, like, no one's saying it's a good idea to kill cops by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think it was a problem for libertarians or small government conservatives or anyone who's concerned remotely about civil liberties to sit back at Michael Brown and Eric Garner and all these cases that we hear so much about, Philando Castile being one of the most recent instances where this happened, to say, all right, cops shouldn't be doing this. They shouldn't be stepping out of bounds, and they just shouldn't be killing innocent people. I don't think that's really hyperbole to sympathize with the victims of this state tyranny. Libertarians, we should be all about confronting this. Instead, you see so many, they're okay with a police state as long as it kills someone they don't like, as long as they rough up the Antifa protesters, then it's okay to them if there's a police state. I'm sure you remember the Tea Party movement in 2010 and 2009 when low taxes was in fashion. What if Obama sent federal police a Glenn Beck rally or something like that? Like that never would have flown well at all to us. But there's so many that seem to have this inconsistent attitude with statism's okay if it's against someone we don't like,
That's very true. That's a major problem that I've always seen within the conservative movement, and especially the Republican Party. All too often, they don't really have a problem with big government as long as it's bringing the hammer down on people they don't like or people to whom they don't relate. They don't have a problem with statism as long as the government doling out benefits to people. They have no problem with it as long as they and people similar to them are benefiting from it. It's only when people who are different from them are benefiting from government largesse, all of a sudden they want to, dismiss them as welfare bums and say, and cut off all that support for them and everything. The fact that libertarians take at least are supposed to take a more consistent approach to that is, again, one of the things that I found appealing about the movement and one of the reasons I joined. And so I agree with you completely when it comes to issues like police brutality. At the end of the day, the police are the government's armed agents. They are the ultimate source of the government's power over the people.
Yes.
The government has the ability to force us to obey when it tells us what to do. It's because it has men and women with guns and badges whom it can send after us and whom it gives the legal authority to use force against us. And so if you really believe in small, limited government, it doesn't make any sense for you to reflexively take the side of the police in any dispute.
Yeah, right. It should be a no-brainer, but it isn't. So that really boils down to, what do we do about it? And what could have been done about it, I think, is the big question on everyone's mind. I'm not one to say that I have all the answers to these things, and I know you don't either, but can those of us who were in the movement in the beginning come together again and say, I think we need a reboot, a new way of reaching people that goes beyond politics per se? I think if we had a little bit of what the Ron Paul revolution had in 08 and 012, when people went crazy for Ron Paul, just like with signs that were made in people's basements and stuff. We didn't need to have this big infrastructure necessarily in Washington, D.C. As great as groups like YAL and SFL and all these wonderful organizations in Washington, D.C. can be, we run into a problem, I think, when we try to preach this idea that we're against centralized bureaucracies. Mm-hmm. And we try to apply that to all of these groups and campaigns sometimes, we try to have a top-down approach, and I don't think that completely works. You know, maybe an organization like SFL would be better off relocating to the middle of Cheyenne, Wyoming. I think DC is poisonous for a lot of political power, to put things lightly. They're not always our friends.
It's the swamp, right?
It is the swamp.
Trump
It is the
didn't
swamp.
even drain the swamp, but he is the swamp thing. He's the swamp creature. He's the creature of the Black Lagoon.
He is.
Absolutely.
He's filling the swamp. He's draining the swamp and putting gators and sharks and all these poisonous snakes back in it.
Yeah. It's so funny how he flip-flops all over the place. Just earlier today on CNN, I saw them playing some footage from one of his campaign rallies during the election last year on the issue of marijuana. He was saying, I think that medical marijuana should be legal, and other than that, we should leave it to the states. And he actually got some applause at this rally. And yet, now that he's in office, he appoints Jeff Sessions as attorney.
Jeff Sessions. I've got one thing to say to Jeff Sessions if he's listening. Just a minute. Jeff Beauregard Sessions, come and take it.
Watch out now, this is going on YouTube.
I'm in a legal state, it's all good.
All right. In fact, what state are you in right now again?
I'm in the beautiful Trinidad, Colorado. I've been trying to see a lot of nature and disengage from a lot of the political craziness that's out there lately.
I hear that, yeah. Where do you think the movement should go from here in terms of reaching out to people from various backgrounds, making the whole liberty message resonate with ordinary people across the country and around the world?
I think there's no one-size-fits-all to all of it. I think depending on who the person is, you always know your own audience. We don't even need anything fancy, really. I think the ideas itself, if they're consistently pro-peace, pro-freedom, and pro-limited government, that ought to be a universal set of principles that a lot of people can get behind. Here's the thing. I'm not a supporter of Bernie Sanders per se. I don't agree with all of his ideas. I'm not a democratic socialist by any stretch, but I lived around a lot of Bernie folks for a lot of 2016 in Oregon and Washington State. A lot of these people were Ron Paul people. Same thing goes for some Trump supporters. I consider Trump's movement to be a little bit different from Bernie in the greater scheme of things, but I think if we saw the Bernie supporters' hatred of this really morally bankrupt, corrosively corrupt culture, there is corporate greed that goes into government. And as long as we have big government, the more damage that can be done by these big corporations that Bernie supporters always gripe about, we can really level with them, I think, in certain areas like that. We'll disagree on economics sometimes, but we'll see a lot of promise from a lot of Bernie supporters who just weren't even ideologically socialist or anything. They just didn't like Hillary Clinton, didn't like Donald Trump. They didn't like the way things were going. A lot of Trump supporters, too, they just wanted to send a middle finger to D.C., and now they're starting to regret a lot of the things that Trump is doing. He's escalating a war in Syria that he vowed that he wouldn't get involved with at one point. Jeff Sessions is also wildly unpopular, even among Donald Trump supporters as well. I happened to recently work a down-ballot campaign with a veteran of Tora Bora, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, a lot of places. He was high up in Veterans for Trump. And it was me, this one guy, and John McCain supporter who were all living pretty much in a trailer park for about a month while we were working this campaign. But I noticed that this particular Trump supporter, that we all got to know each other while we were working this campaign. He was someone who's actually connected with a lot of the Trump administration and people like that. Even he agreed that Jeff Sessions' marijuana policy is ridiculous. It wasn't what a lot of Trump supporters were all about. They heard states' rights, and they thought that that consistently meant states' rights to do what they wanted in terms of whatever marijuana policies that they chose to set. There's some common ground that can be reached with them. The most important thing we probably shouldn't do, that we definitely shouldn't do, is embrace this far-right. How do you even describe this indescribable phenomenon sometimes, this antithesis to liberty as we knew it? We can set a better example, I think.
Absolutely. I totally hear what you're saying about collaboration. That's a point I'm always making to fellow libertarians. A lot of them are very leery of collaborating with folks on the left, and they prefer to collaborate with folks on the right. And I'm thinking, this makes no sense. Just as a practical matter, why wouldn't you collaborate with people who seek policy goals substantially similar to yours, even if they seek those same goals for very different philosophical reasons, which is typically the case? Even so, who cares? At the end of the day, it's a matter of practical politics. There are still so few committed, confirmed libertarians in the country at present that we really have no choice but to work with others. But we can't work with folks on the right when it comes to issues like the drug war or issues like foreign policy and so on, because
immigration especially.
Immigration is another great example. Yeah, so many differences. We have little choice but to work with folks on the left in those areas because that's where there's overlap between our positions and theirs.
Yes.
Why would you want to say, ew, they have cooties, they have communist cooties, I don't want to deal with them? And a lot of them are leery of working with us, but there are people of goodwill on both sides who are willing to. Why wouldn't you, you know?
Yeah, it's common sense, I think, especially to see so many of these avowed leftists who actually, they're starting to see our arguments when we've always been warning about, well, maybe secession isn't always a bad thing. Maybe gun rights are a good thing. You know, liberals are starting to like guns now. We should be embracing that. You know, we shouldn't be scaring them away. Republicans who said Obama needed to stop blaming Bush for all of his problems had a point. They just didn't stay consistent. They should still be there today saying Trump needs to stop blaming Obama and Bush and every other president before him for all of his problems. He's such an enigma to even think about sometimes. He's a danger to the Republican idea as we know it. Not in the uppercase sense, the lowercase Jeffersonian division of government sense. I think this administration is a fundamental threat to that. This idea that like a heavy-handed Latin American dictator type is just going to remove all undesirables, that's not pro-liberty. And we need to be opposing that. And I completely agree with you when you said that we have no choice but to work with the left when they oppose that.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like, a lot of liberals now are starting to reluctantly, grudgingly wake up to the benefits of federalism and the separation of powers. For example, when Obama was president and Republicans were blocking a lot of his agenda, liberal pundits were saying, oh, it's too bad we don't have a system of government like, say, Canada's, where it's so much easier to get laws passed through the legislature and whatnot. And I was saying, oh, not so fast. In Canada, the prime minister appoints Supreme Court justices unilaterally, no check or balance. He appoints the whole Canadian Senate unilaterally, no check or balance. The prime minister can kick members of his own party out of power if in the legislature if they don't vote the way he wants them to vote. You don't want a Republican president to have that kind of power. And now that Trump is in the White House, I think you're starting to see a lot of folks on the left reluctantly wake up to the fact that folks like us in the Liberty Movement were onto something when we were saying, hold up, we want there to be more limits on government power than that. It shouldn't be that easy for government to exercise its will. So just to wrap up, personally, I'd like to see a liberty-oriented faction within both major parties, as well as through the Libertarian Party wherever possible, typically more at the state and local level. That way, no matter which party's in the majority or the minority, will have some influence and we'll be able to try and at least wrest some concessions from the major parties that will help keep advancing the liberty cause, no matter who is in or out of power. Frankly, there are already, I mean, you have the House Freedom Caucus, you got the Republican Liberty Caucus, and there's also a Democratic Freedom Caucus as well. And while they're very small and barely anyone knows about them, the fact that there are any Democrats thinking along that wavelength, I think is a very encouraging sign.
Good.
I think there's definitely room for that in both parties. I'm glad that there are folks like you out there in the movement, particularly young Americans like you, who are still out there fighting the good fight, representing the right cause and taking the right approach to liberty and resisting the right-wing cranks who have infiltrated the movement. Because like I mentioned earlier, I've seen a lot of young idealistic libertarians desert the movement in the past few years because they're disillusioned thanks to those characters crawling out of the woodwork. I mean, I've looked at that with growing frustration and dismay. And my response is, they ain't taking my movement from me. I'm not going to stop calling myself a libertarian because some other people are muddying the waters and poisoning the well. I am always going to represent for my beliefs and for what I stand up for, even if I'm the lone voice crying out in the wilderness. So, you know, I definitely support libertarians like yourself who stick with it, stick with the label, stick with the movement, and are not willing to just leave it up to the right-wing cranks and let them take it over completely. So, you know, I salute you for your efforts, and by all means, keep up the good work and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks again for the kind words and for having me on your show.
My pleasure.